Rob, over to you. Thank you.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, colleagues from around the world. My name's Robert Jenkins. I'm the Global Chief of Education for UNICEF and very pleased to moderate this important session entitled Harnessing Equitable Connectivity and Technology for Learning. And thank you very much to my dear friends and colleagues at UNESCO for hosting this entire meeting, but also this parallel session. Thank you also to our panelists and all to the participants for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. Let me just take a minute to just frame this discussion, then I'll introduce the panelists and then pass over the floor to them one by one. As learning and schooling move deeper into virtual environments, as we've seen during this pandemic and the disruption caused by the pandemic, we recognize the importance of considering the challenges and reviewing those on how to maintain education as a public good and guarantee for all children the right to education. And I know we're all committed to that vision. As it remains uncertain how the current crisis will unfold, and in anticipation for future school closures, this pandemic or future challenges, it is essential that we capture and now build on the experiences and lessons learned on the use of technology to reach all learners, in particular the most vulnerable, and to encourage pedagogical innovation. And it's been often referred to as the opportunity we now have to leapfrog into the future. That includes increasing the flexibility and resilience of education systems. In this session, we'll now dive into these issues and learn from the firsthand of experiences of people on this panel who are working to leverage connectivity and technology for education during this very challenging time. So just quickly about the session, UNESCO is hosting this breakout session, and others are all running in parallel to inform and sharpen an outcome document, as Stefania mentioned in her opening. Now, that's expected to be endorsed by numerous countries at a high-level session, including several heads of state and ministers of education later this week. The present draft of the outcome document speaks to expanded importance of connectivity to the topic that we're all now going to be discussing, and education. It establishes that countries should work to 1, narrow the digital divide, 2, develop open educational resources, and 3, build digital commons to complement face-to-face learning with a view to enable inclusive and equitable technology-supported learning. The paper also further acknowledges that there is a heightened need to protect learners' privacy, foster digital citizenship, and promote education as a public good as it shifts to digital mediums. So let us shift now to our panelists. Each speaker will be provided 5 minutes, and unfortunately I will have to stick to that 5 minutes. So I will come on at 5 minutes and encourage the speakers to wrap up if indeed you're continuing to speak over your time. We're encouraging our speakers to share lessons about connectivity and technology, and also share at least one idea or takeaway that could be taken into the global space to take from their experience that could be of interest to others. We're also asking them to share actions that should be undertaken in the next 15 months from now until the end of next year to better leverage connectivity and technology for learning. Following the 5-minute interventions from each of the speakers, we'll engage in an open discussion. So now quickly, the order of speakers will be, and I'll introduce them again. So I'll just now use their names, but their titles I'll introduce when I pass the floor to them. His Excellency, Mr. Anatole Colonnet Makosa, then to Miss Vicky Collins, third, Mr. Wu Di, fourth, Mr. Albert Forn, fifth, Miss Sonia Jorge, sixth, Ms. Viana Kakule, 7, Ms. Dragana Kupres, 8th, Mr. Joseph Singenmana, and lastly, 9th, but not least, of course, Ms. Jane Munga. So those will be our 5 panelists. So without further ado, recognizing time is limited, thank you again to all our panelists. Thank you to UNESCO. Thank you to all of you who are participating. We look forward to your comments and questions following the interventions from the panelists. And let me now pass over to His Excellency, Mr. Anatole Colonne Makossa, who is the Minister of Primary and Secondary Education and Literacy, the Republic of the Congo. Your Excellency, you now have the floor.
Merci beaucoup, madame. Je suis heureux d'être associé.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to speak to you. I'm going to speak to you very quickly about equitable connectivity and technologies in the context of the Congo, the Republic of the Congo. Of course, if the education system had been better prepared and if we had already implemented remote learning, then it would have been easier. And now there had been plans to introduce such remote learning 10 years ago, but if that had been the case, then we would have been in a better position in the midst of this health crisis. But unfortunately, it's taken a while for such technology to take root, and we are now up against an unprecedented situation, and it's very difficult to get things going. In the Republic of the Congo, we have used a number of tools, and we've got remote learning and online learning, but we know that for online teaching in countries such as ours, where we don't have connectivity available to everybody, you have some 73% of internet access in urban areas, 42% in semi-urban areas, and only 13% in rural areas. So it's an average of 31% of people having access to the internet, which means that we have had a great number of difficulties to deal with. It's been very difficult to have this online teaching. In addition to that, we have television and radio for lessons, and there's 92% in urban areas, 41% in rural areas. That's for television and radio. And so we only get 71% of the population covered by radio and television for schooling. So there's always a shortfall in the cover. And that's why we had printed courses that we made available to students throughout the Republic. Now, what we have to note here is that while we can share our experience, we can say that the current situation has highlighted the need to have television just for education, a station just for education, and that you can get the best coverage of students if you have 100% educational channel. And we can see that you have sports channels, for example. And so this should be done. And so we're currently looking at this as the way of resuming classes. And so there are some students who will have 3 days of live classes in the classroom, and then they'll have 2 days at home, but they'll have the same classes that they can follow either by the internet or by television. And the advantage of that mixed approach is that the classes are then stored in a database, and once they're stored, if there's someone who's missed a class or has not properly understood, they can download the class. So that's one of the advantages of information and communication technologies. So you need to prepare the educational systems so that you can have this remote learning and teaching, and it's likely to be an ongoing process. And the experience in the Congo with support from the UNESCO has gone well. And we had support from the Director General of UNESCO, and we have radio, TV, and web stations, which are now being used to consolidate learning. And that will be done over the next 15 months. And then we'll see how we can make things even better as of next year. So that's what I wanted to say on that subject, on the efforts we made. So first, we have to step up the connectivity. Of course, there's the digital divide, and we have to have more remote learning and teaching. And we need to train the teachers so that they can fit in with these new teaching techniques. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Very helpful. And thank you also for remaining on the panel for the question and answers. Can I now just, again, to save time, I won't attempt to summarize. I'll just immediately pass over to speaker number 2, And may I kindly request Ms. Vicki Collins, the Managing Director of EdTech Hub. You now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Robert. The EdTech Hub is a global not-for-profit research network that exists to empower people who have to make decisions about using technology in education. So we're supported by the UK government, the World Bank, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and we work directly with governments to answer questions about what actually works in EdTech, as well as undertaking and commissioning rigorous research. Obviously, much of our recent work has been driven by the need to find ways to protect teaching and learning at this time of unprecedented disruption. EdTech is relatively new in most education systems. It's rarely implemented at scale. You often find small pockets of interventions, but it's notoriously difficult to scale up and is, of course, continuously evolving. So advising decision makers on what works is not actually very simple for three reasons. First of all, the evidence base, the research base for EdTech is not well developed, and the research that does exist is often also not done at scale or has been carried out under conditions that don't really mimic a real world operating situation very well. Secondly, technologies change really quickly, and this is a problem for people trying to conduct rigorous research, which by its very nature takes some time, into the efficiency and effectiveness of specific products to inform those decisions about how to scale up. And third, EdTech has long suffered from what we call silver bullet syndrome, the myth that there is some simple answer out there somewhere that will fix everything. So often, even promising projects, if they can't demonstrate instant results, they're often at risk of being abandoned in favor of a new idea that looks as if it might present some kind of more immediate payoff. All that said, COVID-19 has made it more important than ever for policymakers to get to grips with technology and connectivity for education. But it's also really important that in our rush to find ways to keep learning going at this time, we don't neglect that global commitment to put equity at the heart of everything we do in education. And in a situation where EdTech has necessarily become more central to learning, some ominous signs are emerging from the research. So new evidence from low-income countries suggests that relatively few children are currently using technology to learn. So for example, in Senegal, less than 11% of students have used radio, TV, or web-based courses to study while they've been out of school. And according to one study, only about 22% of children in Kenya, and I'm sure my panel companion may have something to say about this, currently have access to digital learning materials, even though the government has worked very hard to establish a supportive policy environment. And then this lack of equity is also a significant problem inside countries. Global estimates suggest that at least 580 million students are not reached by any form of remote learning intervention. And an average of 3 in 4 of those who aren't reached live in rural areas. So we see that girls, children with special educational needs, refugees, and the poorest and most vulnerable students are all at risk of deepening exclusion as a result of the pandemic. And as we've just heard from His Excellency, the Minister, internet connectivity in Congo drops from 73% in urban areas to just 13% in the rural areas. So at the Hub, we've already helped about 20 governments to navigate some of the uncertainties about what works and how to try and make EdTech work for everybody. Our work includes thinking through how to keep children learning while schools are closed, as well as how to reopen safely and help students catch up on what they might have missed. And wherever possible, we're also advising on how to use learnings from the current pandemic to strengthen teaching and learning for the future. So today, I'm very quickly going to share 4 things that we've learned through our work this year to try and enrich the discussion. Each one has a specific focus, not just on technology, but also on how we can make use of technology to build more equity into our education systems in the future. First, on gender, the evidence is that access to technology is often more empowering for girls than for boys, with wider benefits that expand far beyond formal education. However, most studies also suggest that cultural bias and gendered assumptions on the part of parents and teachers mean that girls often get less access to technology, both inside and outside the classroom. So there's therefore a risk that increased use of EdTech in learning may increase inequity. However, if we explore a broader range of options, and mobile phones look particularly promising, we may find opportunities to overcome this and facilitate more inclusive and empowering learning opportunities for girls. Secondly, very quickly on learners with disabilities and special educational needs, increasing use of EdTech at system level has the potential to narrow the access gap for these children in many countries. For example, learners with physical or visual impairments can access audio elements of educational TV programs and radio broadcasts. Mobile devices often offer multiple accessibility features, including voice recognition, screen readers, adjustable screen displays, different language settings. But governments really need to think through the range of modalities and media and make sure they're made freely available to ensure we don't have any gaps in accessibility. Third, on remedial education for students who've lost learning time as a result of COVID or indeed any other event. The evidence is that effective catch-up interventions are learner-centric and also provide adequate professional development support to educators. They teach at the right level, responding to children's actual achievement levels and their needs. Technology-supported remedial learning programs also appear to offer extra opportunities to improve learning outcomes, partly because they can offer additional personalization for students. My final observation today on this whistle-stop tour of over half a year's worth of research focuses on international cooperation and education systems. COVID-19 is already having profound effects on economies the world over and will likely result in diminishing resources for education as well as other sectors, as we already heard in the plenary session. Ministries can do much to make the case for maintaining existing levels of investment in teaching and learning, but we also need to explore efficiencies and collaboration on a global level. One way in which we could do that would be, for example, to commit to sharing curriculum-aligned learning resources. High-income countries in particular have it in their power to make available the materials they use domestically as public goods, sharing them digitally as open education resources. COVID-19 is a global problem. Learning poverty is also a global problem. So we need global as well as local solutions to keeping learning going and bridge the equity gap in education while we do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vicky. Can I now pass over to Mr. Wu Di, the professor from Central China Normal University. Professor, you have the floor.
Rob, just a quick note to say that I think the professor is not with us now. We're following up with his team. I hope he'll be able to join us a little bit later, but I don't know if he'll make it. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. So just keep me posted on that, Mark, and we'll come back to the professor when we have another opportunity. Shall I now pass on to Mr. Albert Forn, the director from M Schools GSMA. Mr. Forn, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you to UNESCO and all the partners here for the invitation to participate. GSMA is the Trade Industry Association representative of over 750 mobile operators across the globe and 350 companies across the ecosystem. So we've been, in the mobile space for a long time now, and I'm going to try to give you some data today that I hope will also be able to fuel our conversations going forward. I guess that the COVID-19 pandemic has shed really a new light on the fundamental and strategic role of connectivity and digital infrastructure within the communities that we serve and that our operators serve. Since the start of the pandemic, mobile operators have been an essential part of the response to the crisis, first and foremost by maintaining network performance, but also through extraordinary measures to expand the capacity of networks to face the unprecedented surge in voice and data traffic and to maintain stable connections for public authorities in health, emergency response, education, and other essential sectors. Many operators have also been providing insights powered by AI, for example, and big data to understand mobility patterns of populations and to support decision-making from health authorities to better counter the spread of the virus. Across different markets, mobile operators have also implemented measures to ensure continuity of access to digital services for citizens and businesses enhancing online learning platforms for students, increasing caps in voice and data packages, supporting aid distribution in lower and middle income countries through mobile money platforms, and many more. The pandemic has emphasized existing advocacy efforts on the role and impact of mobile connectivity, the need to ensure digital inclusion and privacy considerations. In some markets, operators and policymakers have come together during this crisis to accelerate policy and regulatory changes. GSMA advocacy with the World Bank, the International Telecommunications Union, and the World Education Forum has also led to joint policy recommendations to maintain connectivity and digital inclusion during COVID-19. If you are interested in some of these recommendations and you just drop me an email, I'd also be very happy to point you towards some of those recommendations that we have made. Over the past few years, there has been continued expansion of mobile broadband networks, and the coverage gap has fallen from 10% to 7% of the global population, or just about under 600 million people who are not covered by existing mobile networks today. However, despite the significant advances in mobile broadband deployment and adoption, billions of people face considerable barriers to going online. There are still around 3.4 billion people who live in an area covered by a mobile broadband network, but who are not using the mobile internet. And we call this the usage gap. In fact, the usage gap is now almost 6 times larger than the coverage gap. This lack of internet use not only excludes individuals from opportunities to overcome the social and economic impact of the current crisis, but also limits the ability of governments to effectively manage the pandemic and its economic fallout. The usage gap is a global challenge, but significant regional disparities persist. If we don't act now, we run the risk of reinforcing existing inequalities in the digital world and further marginalizing vulnerable people, as the 2 previous speakers were also commenting on. As an industry, we are working hard to overcome the barriers to mobile internet adoption by improving access to affordable devices and data plans, building digital skills, investing in local digital ecosystems to make services more relevant, and by ensuring that the internet is safe and secure to use. This crisis reminds us that mobile is more essential than ever. Connectivity opens a window to the world over and above the limits of the pandemic. Now, according to a recent survey, the lack of literacy in digital skills is the biggest perceived barrier to mobile internet adoption among mobile users. Interestingly enough, this skills gap barrier is ranked well above the issue of affordability of mobile connectivity. In the first few months of the pandemic, amid the country lockdowns, mobile traffic increased significantly. An 83% surge globally was carried over mobile networks. When recently surveying mobile operators, we asked them what were the main requests they received from governments and policymakers. 85% of operators responded that they had been first requested support in 2 main areas. One of them being zero rating of varying types of mobile internet access, so that consumers would not cap their data plans when under confinement and be able to continue to use the mobile internet. And the second one was to honor connectivity pledges intended to protect low-income customers and families from being disconnected if they were unable to pay their bills. An overwhelming majority of mobile operators did put in place measures to address these issues, therefore ensuring customers could stay connected to the mobile internet. It will be important to support the mobile operators with legal and regulatory frameworks so that they continue to offer their customers similar initiatives and continue rolling out the networks to achieve maximum coverage. But experience in distance learning tells us that this is not enough. Many of the challenges faced by educators and learners in all different geographies have more to do with skills and preparedness. Educators have struggled to get up to speed with technology while they've had to adapt their teaching practice to new formats and delivery methods. They've had to modify their pedagogy with little or no support, mainly through trial and error. Learners have been on the receiving end of these efforts, in many cases in challenging environments, resulting in very high school dropout rates and also many lost opportunities. To overcome this challenge, we must collectively find ways of empowering educators globally with focused training and resources so that they can transition to new educational paradigm that can be more effective and much more resilient. If we do so, we will also be able to bring on board the 3.4 billion people who are still not connected to the mobile internet, jumpstarting digital inclusion and giving them the opportunity to become the lifelong learners that we should all aspire to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Albert, and thank you also keeping it in time. Much appreciated. Let me now pass the floor to Ms. Sonia Jorge, the Executive Director, Alliance for Affordable Internet. Sonia?
Thank you all. Thank you also for inviting me to be here with you. Since so many of you already started covering so many of the important and critical elements of the challenge that we have ahead, I'll try to focus on a couple of other things that I think are also important to consider. First, let me say that while we must continue all efforts to connect schools and increase the digital skills for all people, including young learners, really supporting the development of digital citizens around the world, everywhere, As you all know, the pandemic has shown that connecting schools alone does not create digital resilience in the face of something like COVID. And neither does connecting households only, which I think is also important to note here. Inter-household power relations, gender relations, and more determine the ability of household members to access and benefit from digital technologies when they are available. And I note these because one of the lessons that I hope many are taking from these really difficult experience that we are all facing in the world is that a holistic approach to connectivity programming is needed. One where broadband infrastructure, affordable quality connections, and appropriate devices are key. So I hear, for example, our panel member Albert from GSMA mentioned the usage gap and mentioned the coverage that exists across the world. I would actually challenge not the usage gap, but the coverage information, because the reality is that even with that coverage that is meant to be broadband, the reality is that quality connectivity is not there for most people that are supposedly covered by mobile networks. Mobile is not the only solution, is a very important and by far the first point of connection for many people in many parts of the world, but is not the only one. And broadband connections, there are many ways of thinking about them. So I want to remind us of that lesson, that this holistic approach to programming connectivity, especially connectivity for learning, is very different than thinking about connectivity for pure mobile use for other kinds of purposes. So what this means for us is that individual access to online digital tools and most critical to meaningful connectivity, which means for us at the Alliance, when we can use the internet every day, using an appropriate device with enough data and a fast connection is absolutely critical if digital connectivity is to be an enabler of education and more, especially for women, girls, rural, and marginalized communities. If these communities continue to be at the tail end of what connectivity is providing, which is low quality, unreliable, minimal devices that do not have the functionality for what we are aiming to contribute here, it's not good enough. We have a long way to go. So we at the Alliance for Affordable Internet and at the Web Foundation are concerned not just about the slow progress to expand broadband infrastructure, quality broadband infrastructure, but we're also concerned about the weak level of commitments towards implementation that we see across the regions, especially in low and middle income countries. In fact, let me share with you a couple of things that our team has been working on. Our analysis recently, which we conducted in collaboration with ITU, shows that we need about $428 billion to make universal access to 4G, to a 4G type quality connection, a reality for everyone. Note that this is the investment cost to ensure that everyone in the world has the same quality baseline connectivity that is required for learning, have access to information, be creative, and productive digital citizens. I am not talking about the kind of connectivity that is called broadband connectivity, but in fact, for most of you here on this panel and most of the participants, would not be enough to provide educational opportunities. And the fact is that this $428 billion is not very much. Think about it. It's about how much the world spends annually on soda, carbonated drinks. If we can spend that much on such unnecessary elements, why can't we spend on making sure that everyone has that quality connection? In fact, the global telecom services market is valued at about $1.74 trillion in 2019, with continued growth planned through 2027 at about 5%. I think we have enough resources. We need the commitment, we need the will, and we need, most importantly, which is a message I want to leave you with, a change in mindset. From a purely business focus and revenue-driven paradigm to one where the provision of a public good, which connectivity to the internet is indeed, is in the public interest. Only when that rebalance takes place can we ensure that public and private partnerships really become a win-win proposition. And remember, win-win means that everyone wins. Everyone benefits equally. It's not about some benefiting a lot and some benefiting very little. One where we are grounded on human rights and work for the social good. That's the true mindset that we need to change the way we think about the connectivity challenge in the world. And it is indeed possible. We know exactly what we need to do. If we know exactly how much we need to invest, we know how we need to work together to make sure that for those of us working connectivity policy and regulatory frameworks, etc., that support those of you in the education sector that need us to do our job so that you can do your job as well. We all need to embrace the fact that access to the internet is a public good and a basic right. It's not a luxury. And with that, I remind you, it's not just about the pure task of providing connectivity. It's making sure that that connectivity is affordable, is meaningful, and it comes with a level of quality and appropriate device that people need to be productive for whichever task they choose in their lives, including being educated, including benefiting from digital opportunities and EdTech and all other kinds of possibilities that we know currently, as Vicky and others already mentioned, is not the case. There's far too many people outside of the possibility. We can't accept that. We just simply cannot accept that. We all need to work together. So thank you, and I hope you can join us in that journey.
Thank you very much, Sonia. Very much appreciated. May I now pass to our next speaker, Ms. Viana Kakule, the advisor to the Minister of Higher Education in South Sudan. Viana, you have the floor.
Rob, I'm sorry. I think she's unable to connect, unfortunately, but if we can move to the next speaker. Thank you.
Absolutely, and we'll just maybe give it a shot to both of those panelists after our final panelist member to see if they're managed to connect by then. Okay, thanks. Let me turn now to our next speaker, Ms. Dragana Kupres, the project manager for the Croatian Academic and Research Network. May I pass to you, please?
Thank you, Robert. So I will shortly share with you some of our experiences from Croatia in our response to emergency distance education. So like in many other countries, during the spring lockdown, our education system also transitioned to completely distance education. And this happened almost overnight, like in many other countries. We are now in a different situation right now. We have a much more flexible approach right now. And in this approach, schools can choose from 3 different models. They can choose to run their schools in a new kind of a normal, but fully face-to-face. They can choose to run the education in some kind of a combination, some students going to school, some online, and they can choose to switch completely to online school. So most of our schools, they chose the face-to-face model, as you can imagine, because most of us, we want to really get into the old normal. However, some of the schools, they had to choose the online mode because of their epidemiological situation. And this is something that I think awaits us in the next 15 months, this flexible approach, running from face-to-face to online and back to face-to-face mode again. So in Croatia, we were getting ready for this situation without knowing that we are getting ready. We had several national investments in technology and education, namely our eSchools project that is still running. But nevertheless, we faced many challenges, especially in scaling up the digital infrastructure, but also in digital divide. And I'm not talking only about the infrastructure and equipment, I'm talking also about the lack of skills, in teachers and students for fully online teaching, not only using technology in classrooms. We also faced lack of digital learning materials. We had some, but not everything, especially for vocational schools. So what we chose to have is something that I can describe as a hybrid approach. We have offered some centralized services like authentication service that each student and teacher could connect to our learning platforms with their personal identity manager. And this was very important for the safe environment that they could join, and also for tracking the progress of students. However, for schools, it was possible to choose from a couple of major platforms that we offer to them, namely Moodle, which was one of our installation, but we also had to use the commercial clouds, namely Microsoft Teams and Yammer, and also Google Suite for Education, because our own infrastructure was not enough. Talking about the equipment and the connection, most of the students had some of the equipment, and some were provided by the schools and by the ministry. However, 4% of parents, they report that their children didn't have access to either equipment or the internet, which is really, really an important lesson that we have learned. We have set up a number of monitoring, research, and evaluation actions during that situation, because we wanted to learn. We wanted to know what was happening so that we can face this new situation better prepared. And what we have learned that teachers and students, they really developed their digital competences. They acquired very important experience. They even raised their self-confidence, and some of them they changed their attitudes to technology in education. However, the costs for some of them was really high. Both teachers and students and some of the parents, they reported fatigue, burnout during difficult months of lockdown and online schooling, and even physical pain from long sitting hours in front of the computer. So this is something that we have to take in mind when speaking about possibilities going again fully online. And what we also have learned, we are doing the measurement of digital maturity of schools, which is a kind of an assessment of digital transformation of schools. And we have saw that most of our schools, they have managed to jump on a much higher level of digital maturity during and after the transition into digital schooling. However, the lowest level of digital maturity area was not in the infrastructure and equipment, it was in planning, managing, and leadership area. And this is consistent with our previous findings, that this area needs much more attention together with the infrastructure and equipment part. So our lesson that we are still trying to learn and impose here in the new normal is that we have to approach the situation with much greater flexibility and with agile planning. And to be able to do that, we have to be aware of the situation. We have to monitor, we have to research, and then plan based on the research findings. And in that planning include schools, because it's very, very important that we include them in the decisions of when they move online and when they move face-to-face. And in doing that, of course, we have to support our teachers continuously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dragana. We greatly appreciate your interventions and your perspective. May I now pass over to our next panelist, Mr. Joseph Sengamana, the Director of MasterCard Foundation's Center for Innovative Teaching and Learning in ICT. Joseph, you have the floor.
Thanks, Robert. Thank you very much. Thanks to all the panelists that have spoken before me. I apologize if I repeat some of the things that were said before. I think there is a lot of good points that were made. And for my intervention, I'll simply share what we are seeing on the ground in Africa. The MasterCard Foundation is a foundation that's based in Canada, Toronto, Canada, and it operates in Canada and in Africa. In Africa, the Massacre Foundation is currently implementing the Young Africa Works strategy, which focuses on enabling 30 million young Africans to obtain dignified and satisfied work by the year 2030. At the heart of this effort is obviously education, as education will provide that opportunity or that path to these jobs. And to support that, we do recognize, even before the pandemic, the important role of technology. And that's why the center, which I have the privilege to lead, was established. And the center in essence, was tasked with identifying opportunities on how to tap into the power of technology to innovate and enable increasing learning outcome in schools as well as outside the school. So what we've seen is that at the onset of the pandemic, a lot of countries on the continent, like everywhere in the world, closed the schools and quickly realized just how unprepared we were for this situation. We realized that kids who are now did not have opportunity to go to schools. Initially was starting would be a short time, but then in reality kicks in that it's going to take it much longer than previously anticipated. And so there was a scramble on how do we actually enable these kids to continue learning. And by we, I mean the continent. The first thing that was to establish some sort of the online learning. But that quickly becomes, we come to realize that the excellent minister has pointed out, and others have pointed out, just how short that internet access is. Majority of the students do not have access to internet, and therefore, even the little material that was available could not reach them. And so what the government then did was to extend to television and to extend to radio in order to extend or to increase the opportunities for them to learn. But even with that, the limitation of one-way learning is quite evident. Even though the majority of people would actually have access to radio and television, it's still not all students who would have access to that. And so that's sort of like the reality that people kept running into. At the center, we had already started working with EdTech entrepreneurs on the continent. And our job was to really work with them to figure out how can they plug the gaps, so to speak. Realizing that using internet is not going to be it's not going to provide access to everyone. Our EdTech entrepreneurs started looking at other solutions, such as SMS-based solutions. So one of our fellow, Ineza Education, that's based out of Kenya, for instance, has expanded its operations in 3 countries, in Ghana as well as in Rwanda now, where they are providing access to education through SMS services. They digitize the content into bite size, and so people are able to access that using their regular phones. And with that, students are actually able to learn and be able to access, to actually pose questions to a bank of teachers who then are able to respond to them via the same technology. So this is just to show you some of the innovation that's coming out of the EdTech community to address some of the shortcomings or the shortcomings that exist in the system. With that, we've seen some expansion. We also have seen some really increase in demand. For instance, one of our EdTech entrepreneurs out of South Africa, Siavula, has seen 400% increase in demand of their services. And then when they look at the demographic that's accessing the service, is actually not just the upper, the people with the means, but also the lower income services are accessing that. So we need to find ways of increasing that access. Another thing that we saw, and I think that we can really build on, is the collaboration. So for instance, in South Africa and in Rwanda, we have seen telcos work with the ministries of education to zero rate access to education material. Now, that doesn't solve the whole problem, But to address the point that Albert made about the service gap or access gap, is that with a 0 rating, we've seen an uptick of those services. So I think that there is an opportunity to expand on that and make sure that the students who have access to internet at least have access to the content. And also building on that, we do realize that there are areas, and I think that's the point that Sonia was making, that just there is no commercial imperative to extend connectivity to. So how can we work together, both the private and the public sector, to make sure that those areas are reached as well? The use of universal service funds, for instance. These are opportunities, there are policy opportunities that can be tapped into to really expand connectivity beyond the rural and the ones that have the most commercial imperative to do so. And so those are some of the things we need to look at, particularly in the next 15 months, where we realize that some of these challenges could come back to us as well. We've seen countries that are opened up are now, facing with the reality to close again. So when we open up here and extend, schools going back to services, I think we need to pay attention to what could potentially happen and strengthen those measures that can enable us to go back into extending learning. And one of the things that I'll mention as which really fit into the reimagining learning is to make sure that we get away from this school-centric education to learning-based education. One that enables us to learn, for the students to learn while they're at school or where they're at home, and figure out what it will take for us to really make that a reality and make sure that no child is left behind. I'll pause at that and return the remainder of my time to Robert.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it, Joseph. Very helpful intervention, and we look forward to you participating also in the Q&A. Can I now pass the floor to Ms. Jane Munga, who's the Economic and Policy Advisor to the Cabinet Secretary for ICT and Youth Affairs in Kenya. Jane, you have the floor.
Thank you, Robert, and good afternoon and good morning and good day to all. Today in Kenya, it is what we call Mashujaa Day, it's a public holiday, whereby we celebrate heroes. Mashujaa means heroes. I've had a lot of good speeches here. I have had a lot of things that are happening. And I just want to take the time, not just to greet you this afternoon, but also to recognize that work and also call you heroes and continue to wish you all the best in your efforts that you're doing. So to my remarks, in March 2020, like most of the world, Kenya found itself at the cusp of COVID-19. And just like what we've had in Croatia, we literally had to close down our schooling system. And only in the past week have we started to see some partial reopening of online or face-to-face schooling. This has been temperamented with just what we call the critical classes. Those are who are already doing the national exams. So Kenya, like most other governments, could not have anticipated the wide-ranging social and economic effects of COVID-19. However, I want to note that existing investments did provide a foundation of which can help mitigate some of the effects. Kenya has been known for a good coverage, about 90% of internet coverage. Most of this is mostly mobile. We do have other initiatives like the National Fiber Optic Backbone, which tries to connect all public institutions. And this, for the most part, has helped us mitigate some of the effects and to see some of the vibrant and technological responses that came from the EdTech sector. For one, we saw a rise in online virtual lessons, both in private and public schools. We can for sure say that this was mostly in the private schools and those able places, so mostly with the good socioeconomic backgrounds. And so government had to have the task of trying to leveling out this effect because we did not want to see a digital divide in this season. So we had some interventions. The first one was the Ministry of Education through the Kenya Institute of Curriculum Development secured consent to have children's education content freely accessible for rebroadcast during watershed periods by both radio and TV stations in Kenya. At the same time, to ensure that there's content, excuse me, the Communications Authority gazetted a policy to designate the KICD EDU TV channel and Kenya Broadcasting Channel as a must carry channel for all licensed DTT TV broadcast signals and paid TV platforms in Kenya. Also, concerted efforts were made to ensure that KICD, through the Teacher Service Commission, brought in teachers to deliver this content digitally. These interventions and others have created a platform for learners to watch a variety of relevant education content on television. We, however, do note that there are a lot of challenges because still the gap in Kenya is between the rural and semi-urban is quite large, and this continues to be a challenge. However, I want to note, and I want to now focus, at least for the next 2 minutes, I hope I still have 2 minutes, on other lessons that may have emerged from the pandemic, and in particular, one that came with a collision of what I would call a collision of ideas that I believe is destined to leapfrog Kenya to the next learning digital experience. As you may know, in 2016, Kenya rolled out the Digital Learning Program, which is a government initiative to integrate all ICTs through across all levels of education. From the beginning, we started with the first grade to third grade learners, learning how to use technologies and increasingly using to learn the technologies. And as you mature, also learning how to use the technology, to adapt to it, to innovate and deploy the various applications. Then this was rolled out beginning 2016. Now fast forward to when the COVID-19 pandemic came about, and government had already started negotiations or collaborations with what I call another key project that is called GIGA. GIGA is an initiative that has been launched by UNICEF and ITU to connect every child, young person to the internet. GIGA could not have come at a timelier time. GIGA has provided an accelerated response to provide connectivity to cover our national targets under the Digital Learning Project. GIGA's goal is to support every young person to learn anywhere, anytime by connecting schools and every young person to the internet. So what does GIGA do? The objective, in conjunction with the Ministry of ICT and Education, is using a strong data infrastructure to identify the unmet demand and monitor the quality of the internet. And also, and this I think is really important at this time, is also to develop sustainable financial models that will address the current market failures in terms of infrastructure and pricing. And thirdly, to use suitable new technologies to extend the reach. So through this collaboration, we've been able to fast track digital connectivity. And through the power of collaboration, GIGA is supporting Kenya to meet national targets that have already been set out. Currently, we've already rolled out through a pilot project to 1160 schools, identified in 1160 schools in the pilot, which one identified across all 47 counties in Kenya. And this is a mix of the rural, peri-urban, urban, and schools catering to children with disabilities. This is a project that can be scaled up in Africa. We believe it's something that we can all learn from, as it's something that has potential for scaling up. So as I conclude, connectivity is no longer an option, and this is something that we have learned, but an imperative. We have to accelerate connecting all learners, provide the learners with devices, and also the appropriate digital content. We therefore need to align our public funding sources to support connectivity. We also need to broker partnerships with initiatives like, for example, what I've just said, GIGA, and other key public sector connectivity players. We also need to advocate and utilize universal service funds, which we have been using to connect our secondary schools, and also to provide access to connectivity, especially in the far-flung areas. In essence, we need to innovate. We need to develop blended financing platforms to find new models that can help us urgently deliver on connectivity for the young people without forgetting those in the hard to reach and rural areas. So I want to end my remarks there and look forward to the next session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane. Very useful, very insightful, and much appreciated. I now see that Mr. Wu Di, the professor from the Central China Normal University, has managed to connect. As you remember, we passed over him earlier. Can I, Mr. Di, I'm hoping you're able to come through. Can I pass you the floor, please?
Yes, of course. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. The floor is yours.
Okay, so sorry for a little technical problem. So I want to give a little talk about the promote educational equity during the pandemic. Information technology has a significant impact on education, which is leading the profound changes in learning environment, content, and methods. The response to pandemic highlights the importance of ICT in education. So I wanted to share the topic one, the practice and the experiences. In 2012, China issued a national 10-year plan for ICT in education. The goal of the plan is to provide a high-speed network connection for each school and provide high-quality resources for each class, provide a cyber learning space for each student and teacher. In addition, we established a national public service platform for educational resources and a national public service platform for educational management. Then we provide digital teaching facilities and resources for more than 60,000 teaching spots. we trained over 10 million teachers to promote the ICT competency. During the COVID-19 pandemic, China has launched a large-scale online teaching practice involving hundreds of thousands of schools, more than 200 million K-12 school students, and more than 10 million teachers. For example, since February 17th, China launched the officially national teaching cloud platform for K-12 school. By early May, the total number of visitors has exceeded 2 billion. But at the same time, the China Education Network Television has launched the class based on TV, which received high audience rating. It provides an opportunity for students in rural areas to share high-quality educational resources and promotes educational equity effectively. Here are some examples. In Wuhan City, the government launched the online courses based on the network cloud platform, provide online learning opportunities for more than 1 million K-12 school students, enabling students to realize learning at home effectively for almost 1 semester. Guizhou province has opened the Sky courses, which allow students to access the free unified educational resources through TV. By establishing the unified schedule, progress, and requirements, in my university, Central China Normal University, we already launched the cloud classroom platform before the pandemic to support teaching. During the outbreak of COVID-19, we finished all the courses teaching in last semester based on the cloud platform. In addition, we also want to provide network connections and terminal equipment for rural area students. For example, in Wuhan, Education Bureau has cooperated with enterprises, gave tablet PCs to about 200 students who lacked learning devices. Thanks to the achievements in the past few years, China has successfully carried out online teaching during the pandemic. So the topic 2, I want to share some considerations and suggestions. Because we are very likely to face the challenge of pandemic-related disruptions, I want to share several suggestions. Firstly, it is suggested to explore different learning methods according to regional conditions. In countries and regions which have good infrastructure conditions, we recommend to combining the online teaching and self-learning to realize effective internet-based online teaching. In regions which have weak network infrastructure conditions, we recommend television-based learning, which is a convenient way for students to share the learning resource. Secondly, it is suggested to attach importance to resource platform and learning terminal. On the one hand, developing public service platform of educational resources based on cloud technology to provide abundant resources support for online learning. On the other hand, we should give our best efforts to ensure every student is equipped with necessary learning terminal equipment, for example, personal computer and mobile phones and iPads, especially for students in rural areas. Thirdly, it is suggested to improve teachers' information literacy. Teachers' information literacy plays a key role in online teaching, but many teachers are not ready yet. So we should provide online and offline training as well as practical training to help teachers improving their abilities of using ICT in teaching and get prepared for the unpredictable change in the next months. That's all I want to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lee. It's greatly appreciated and very insightful. And of course, the scale is always very impressive when you're into the millions, as you've just mentioned. Now we do have some, I'm going to encourage all other participants and panelists to involve themselves in the discussion through the Q&A function. I'm going to open up the floor to see if any of the panelists would like to react to anything they've heard from their fellow panelists. But before we do that, Mark, do you want to, can I pass to you to see if you want to pull anything from the Q&A so far? Can I pass to you, Mark?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rob. Some very interesting questions coming in through the Q&A function, and encourage the audience members to ask more. We had a couple different questions about making better use of sort of TV and radio, sort of recognition that those are not necessarily interactive platforms, but perhaps there are strategies to make them more interactive given their reach, and especially their reach to the sort of the most marginalized. And perhaps some of our panelists have ideas about ways that that has been used sort of creatively. There were some other comments about...
Maybe I'll just hold you right there, Mark, and we'll take these one at a time. Yep. So I think many people have talked about the digital divide and the importance of overcoming that, et cetera. But many panelists have mentioned exactly what you're saying, Mark, the importance of current technology, current reach of television, radio. Can we just zero in on that for a couple minutes? Can I see if any panelists just feel free to perhaps come off mute? Yeah, I see Vicky's hand first. I'll pass to Vicky, and then I'll see if any of the other panelists would also like to come in on after Vicky, specifically on how best to use TV and radio. Vicky.
Yeah, I actually saw a really interesting question about this as we went along, and the question was about how you enrich TV and radio content so that there's some interactivity, so that those children who can't access online don't miss out on the ability to take part. So I quickly checked out with my team, and they say, I'm gonna read what I've already written. You can build interactivity into TV and radio content. You can do things like give cues in TV shows or radio shows from characters that feature in there to allow children to interact. You can also suggest complementing those activities with paper-based activities and exercises. You can run SMS polls. You can run quizzes. You can give children's parents materials to help them interact. And at the Hub, we're also currently testing the effectiveness of adding some human factors to radio, like some kind of co-teachers. And what we've got is radio sessions being pre-recorded and then aired on Saturdays. And then children come to a central location to listen to the session. And there's a co-teacher there, which is usually an older sibling or a parent, who's there to kind of help them implement some of the activities. So those are just some of the ways in which you can make those older technological media a little bit more interactive.
Thank you very much, Vicky. It actually reminds me of a data point I saw in response to the school closures to Ebola in West Africa on the radio. And UNICEF supported a study there that concluded that a certain percentage, and I can't remember what the percentage, but significant percentage of children found the radio more personalized than their attending school in person, which of course is somewhat counterintuitive, but I think it just related to the one-on-one sense of a radio and some of these other very important points you've mentioned, Vicky. Can I see if any other panelists would like to come in before I pass back to Mark to look for, to continue on the discussions from the Q&A? But would another panelist like to come in specifically on using the radio and TV and evidence they've come across? Anyone? Yeah, I've got Jane and then Joseph. Shall we? Jane, can I pass to you? And then Joseph, I'll come to you. Jane.
Yes, thank you, Robert, and thank you for those comments, Vicky.
Sorry, just a sec, Jane, and then Your Excellency, I'll come to you. I saw your hand, so I've got three panelists coming in. Sorry, Jane, back to you.
Thank you. What in Kenya that we have done, because it's something that we really use to integrate learning, is we've also enhanced the classroom experience by a very rudimentary way of interacting, is using your phone and forming what we call WhatsApp groups. So, for example, I'm in multiple WhatsApp groups for each child and their teachers. So we have the timetable for the radio, TV, or the one that they're supposed to watch. And in the evening, the teacher then sends the questions and answers then for the children to give their feedback. So I mean, these are very simple, and not every child sometimes has a smartphone, but it really helps in that essence where you can still continue to interact beyond the TV. And now using our own smartphones to see how that interaction can be done. So just a very simple, but I think it really helps in keeping also that social network for your own classroom. Thank you.
I really appreciate that, Jane. I really appreciate the practical nature and the simplicity of it. And I think that's very helpful in this discussion. Before moving to His Excellency, Joseph, as mentioned, can I pass the floor to you?
Sure. Thanks, Robert. I was just going to build on what Jen just said. So for instance, the NS Education is doing something in Kenya and in Rwanda where they use a function called Ask the Teacher in conjunction with the TV and radio broadcast. So the kids could be watching TV and listening to the radio. And if they have a question, they can SMS a question directly to a bank of teachers, and the teacher were able to interact with them. So that's one way of, I mean, you're not getting direct interactivity on the radio, but you have a system that backs it up. And this is really something that we've seen work, particularly in this time of COVID, where you can gather at a location. So that's one way of doing it. And then subsequently, once a school resumes, you can have those type of sort of like satellite gathering that Vicky was mentioning. Thanks.
I really appreciate that. And I think it is definitely showing some promise. Both the gathering of children around a radio, TV, but also I know panelists have also mentioned the importance of supporting parents and supplementing TV or radio with support directly to parents. Your Excellency, Minister Makosa, can I pass to you, please?
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. I can tell you about the experience of the Congo during lockdown. We had a number of approaches. Well, for TV and radio, the classes were recorded and could be broadcast and rebroadcast. And we had a teacher with a number of students. We knew who the students were. So that was one category of students. Sometimes there were 5 or 6 or 10 of them in the classroom. And then the students are there as a pretext, if you like. And then the questions that children can ask, and they're relevant to all students because you assume that they encounter the same difficulties. And so then the course is broadcast with the questions. But what's even more important is that every week, because this concerned a large number of students during lockdown, we had a webinar every week with a number of students on the platform. And there was one group that was connected and which could react and interact with the teachers and ask all the questions. For example, there was a class and they said, well, we had this class this week, this was the general objective, this was the specific objective, this was the operational objective. And then the teacher could sum up the class, which was the class for the week. And then via Zoom, the students could ask the teachers questions. And then the teachers could answer them. We got a panorama of questions live on Zoom, but there were hundreds or thousands of students who couldn't ask questions, but they were following the explanations, the questions and the answers given by the teachers. And we saw that that worked. And every week, or rather at the end of every week, at the weekend, we had more and more participants. And so we saw that the students were interested in that interactivity, which they didn't have with the broadcast classes during the week. And now, with the educational station we've set up, there are the basic classes which are recorded and stored. And when they're broadcast, not only do you have the students and teachers having access to this and they can improve their practice. And it's also good for the teachers who can improve their teaching practices. But there's also one day at the weekend when there's interaction with students who are online and the television viewers can follow that online discussion. So this means we need to set up conditions where you can have interactivity, because if you don't have an interaction between the students and the teachers, if it's just one-way teaching, then you'll have other problems. And we also had an experiment during the lockdown with virtual classes. In other words, each school had a link with the students who could ask questions via text messaging, for example. or via WhatsApp, whatever it was, or sometimes on Facebook, and they got their answers. But what's important is that you can see that you really need to have a systematic approach of remote learning, and particularly for teacher training. And this needs to be part of the initial teacher training and continuous teacher training. In other words, we have to include remote teaching as an additional approach or a complementary approach to classic formal teaching. We obviously have to do that today. That's what I wanted to say. And obviously you have to take into account special conditions for the most vulnerable students and communities so that they're included. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. Really appreciate it. I really appreciate your emphasis on a systematic approach and being very purposive of leveraging the various different technologies. Very impressive, and I'm sure all the panelists would agree, and I would imagine the participant, all of us agree on the importance of leveraging all technology now, particularly with a commitment to reach the most vulnerable while we continue to overcome the digital divide. And some of these very practical examples on how to do that are, I think, very useful and need to be further documented. As you say, Minister, to make the learning more individualized, to make it more interactive, but also I appreciate the importance of not only leveraging technology to reach students and children directly, but also as a means of furthering professional development and including that in teacher training and teacher support as well. So unless I'm really hoping, because I can't see all the panelists at once, so please, I just want to ask the panel, if you feel I'm not seeing you, then please just come off mute and jump on. But I'm going to just hold the conversation now at the point of the multiple technologies radio TV. And Mark, I'm going to pass back to you to dip into the Q&A, please. Mark, can I pass to you?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rob. Building on the minister's point about, other roles for tech and reaching teachers, we have an interesting question here from Christy Newman, noting that we often hear these calls for sort of increased public financing for connectivity and technology. And she mentions that often makes people in education a bit nervous. We saw a report from the Special Rapporteur on the right to education from the UN talk about this sort of, that edutech often comes with a conversation about privatization of education, private networks and other things, and some concerns around that. And Christy is asking, do we really want to direct sort of limited public financing towards expanding connectivity when its sort of track record for improving teaching and learning is fairly limited? And she also asks about, we're often talking about sort of student-focused edutech, but what about the cases for edutech that would be sort of purely teacher-focused or systems focused? So I think a very interesting question, and wanted to add that to the conversation. Thank you.
Really appreciate it, Mark. Thanks. So I think we should now turn, in some of our remaining minutes, to financing. And we recognize one of our panelists I know mentioned in comparison to many other large expenditures, like, for example, on soda drinks, Sonia, I remember you mentioning it is to keep things into perspective. It's not a large amount of money, but can I pass to panelists and maybe ask, do you have examples of how countries have been able to finance overcoming the digital divide or maximizing the impact of technology-enabled, IT-enabled learning? Comments from a panelist on financing? Sonia.
Thank you, Robert. I'm happy to jump in. I would.
Sonia, we're just having a bit of trouble hearing you.
Can you hear me?
It's a little weak, maybe, but yeah, we can hear you.
Okay.
Over to you.
Is it better now?
It's better now. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Connectivity doesn't work everywhere in the world, as you know, even in those quasi-developed countries. So One of the things that I think is important here, and I know you are the experts on the education side, what I would say is that from a financing perspective, there actually have been some very interesting ways of not just financing connectivity and the infrastructure that will allow for connectivity, but really co-financing projects with the idea, and I think this is something I wanted to highlight, especially because of the question that Mark just highlighted from Christy. The goal here is not a competition between, for public funds. First and foremost, we all need to accept the realities that there's just not enough public funding. Public funding needs to increase overall. I remember, I think it was Vicky or someone else earlier on in the panel that mentioned that education gets about 1%. I don't know if it's all development aid or of some of the public funds. I don't know exactly where that comes from. I can tell you that we actually have done very thorough analysis of how multilateral development banks have invested or not in ICT in general projects, including those that support education. And I can tell you that it's less than 1%. The few cases that have reached 1.5% was a victory. So if you think about the gamut of infrastructure projects and overall development aid that is going across the world into different kinds of sectors, the ICT sector actually doesn't get much. And the reason why is because there's this assumption that primarily this particular sector benefits tremendously from private investment, which is really important. As others also pointed out, I mean, private sector is key in making a lot of the investments, but it's not sufficient. And I think the important thing is, as connectivity becomes and access to the internet becomes a public good, there is a need to rethink the way we think about public interest and public funding and public support to that public good as we think about it across all other public goods and other utilities that we have, education being one. But the idea here is not to compete, it's to complement. And the investments in connectivity are to support the outcomes of health, education, agriculture, and other kinds of development outcomes, are not an imposition. It's not the other way around. And I think it's something that I'm sure all of you agree here on this panel and your participants, is that connectivity and technology is not here to be imposed. It's really as a problem solver. And so we need to make sure that as we think about financing, Robert, we also think about it that way. In what way can we invest in technology, connectivity, and more so that it supports those other outcomes? It's not instead of, it's so it supports and complements in a way that overall, again, it's a win-win proposition.
I appreciate that, Sonia. Other panelists would like to weigh in on financing, how their examples they'd like to share. Is that you trying to come in, please, Vicky?
Sorry, I just wanted to add something on the importance, not just of thinking about this at a country level and making the case at a country level for finance, but finding more creative ways for us to collaborate globally. So I mentioned earlier the idea of, making appropriate learning materials available open source online would be a very easy thing for some, for many high income countries to do, not to keep what they're doing domestically in education separately from what their development ministry or their foreign ministry is doing on the other side of the house. And I think there was actually an answer in the questions about something that France is doing in terms of Francophone learning materials, which I think is obviously especially welcome, because I think that's often quite a difficult one. But there are other areas we could look at as well, like I'm aware of various countries trying to develop what we call VLEs, virtual learning environments, including virtual learning environments that don't involve all children having to be online all the time. These are a great idea, but it's unclear to me why every country needs to develop its own proprietary system. There surely are ways in which we can share material and solutions across borders.
Appreciate that point, Vicky. Thank you. Jane, I've got Jane and then Albert, and I'm just going to flag, we have about 5 minutes left, and I'll just see if also Mark has one final question, urgent question coming from the Q&A, but I'll go with Jane and Albert now, still on the financing. Jane, floor is yours.
Thank you. I want to talk about some interconnected initiatives that we are trying to innovate in government. As I mentioned earlier, we have what we call a national fiber optic backbone. And this is what we are trying to utilize the already existing infrastructure and in conjunction with the Universal Service Fund. We're using the already the NOFB, that infrastructure that is already there, because it terminates at every public institution. And right now we're just using it as a last mile to connect the local schools that are nearby it. So we are trying to harness already existing government investment, which already saves a lot of the laying of the infrastructure on itself. And then now using the USF fund to see how we can do the last mile connectivity to the school. And also, again, I really want to also to mention what we said earlier about collaborations. These new blended financing options like coming with Giga are also very crucial to help the private sector and other companies just to come in and support what government is doing. Thank you. Back to you, Robert.
I really appreciate the point you're raising, Jane, on leveraging existing financing to the maximum, but also your comments repeatedly on Giga as a key initiative. Very much appreciated. Albert, can I pass to you?
Yeah, thank you, Robert. I just wanted to maybe pivot back to some of the things I said at the beginning, and I'm not trying to disagree with anyone in particular here on this call. I think everyone has made excellent points. But I am a little bit worried that we focus quite a bit on, and in this last financing bit as well, on paying for technology and in whatever way or fashion, and improving existing technology or connectivity or whatever that may be. And it is a valid point, but I would like to make sure that we don't leave out that financing and that resourcing has to go towards many other aspects of education, such as teacher training and such as overcoming some of the barriers that we have towards transforming our education systems into systems that are more prepared and reliable and resilient towards situations as we are having now. I think we're all pretty much we would agree with this. So I'm not trying to say that we don't need to finance certain things, but I mean very certainly we do need to focus on how we bring resources to leverage teachers and to leverage what they need to do and how they need to transform their pedagogy and their education to be able to support situations such as the one we're living in today.
Thanks very much, Albert. Mark, is there any sort of urgent or must share question at this point, just as we're wrapping up?
One other thing maybe to bring in the discussion, Rob, a couple people made the points about the centrality of families during this pandemic, and that despite all these efforts to train teachers in digital technologies, that because of the school closures and the ongoing disruptions, that a lot of education, even when it's delivered remotely, whether through digital technologies, TV, radio, is very dependent on families and parents. And so ideas to sort of bring them into this tech scenario, I think a lot of people sort of thinking about that, asking about that, innovations there and possible solutions to better engage families. And when schools reopen, as you mentioned, to kind of continue that engagement with families and parents and keep them involved. Over.
Thanks, Mark. Much appreciated. And thanks, Joseph, for your comment in the chat regarding the universal service funds. Back to the financing. Now, back to Mark's point, can I ask the panelists to reflect on supporting parents, supporting families, supporting, in addition to the school system and educators, direct support, if you'd like, to children and caregivers? Comments from panelists, thoughts, experience? I've got Albert.
Yeah.
And then Joseph. Yeah, Albert, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think this is a very important issue that has come up, and we've seen this in many of the different countries that have been affected by the lockdowns as well. The support that learners receive from their families in many different ways are very important to be able to ensure continuity and to guarantee that those learners are able to continue within their education. And some of the reasons for school dropouts go back to families and to the environments of some of these learners, and have to manage on a day-to-day basis. So yes, I mean, taking steps to support families to help them support their children and their learners and their communities. This is very, very important. It's something that is very difficult to manage because obviously it's a social issue. It has many other aspects that we would have to dwell on as well. But anything that we could do, maybe not just training the trainers or training the teachers, but also training these families and helping them with knowledge and things that they can do to support their kids might be very effective as well.
Thanks, Albert. Much appreciated. Joseph, just a sentence or two. Can I pass to you?
Sure. Now, just quickly echo what Albert just said. I think the parents found themselves in a position to be teachers overnight, unprepared, and with little support. We talked about how teachers need support when it comes to online teaching. But now imagine the parents who do not even have the pedagogical, knowledge that the teachers have. Now suddenly they're becoming teachers, and I think we really need to see some sort of mechanisms, be it policy on the policy level, or even on the EdTech side, just to provide some sort of tools that the parents can use to help them support their kids, specifically in situations such as the lockdowns that we all have experienced.
Thank you very much. That unfortunately brings us to the end of our time. So that I think the three major takeaways, if I can just put on the table, one is a recognition by all of us of the importance of overcoming the digital divide, and it is possible financing wise, etc. Many countries are working to that. Two, in the meantime, we are continuing to employ all different multiple channels of IT enabled, from a full range of world-class IT enabled platforms to digital radio, television, printed learning materials, as we heard from many, as a way of reaching the most marginalized. And the third point, I think, is the importance of maximizing each one of these tools and recognizing they're just tools. They need to be leveraged and maximized to have an impact on learning and on skill development, with a particular eye on reaching the most marginalized. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the participants. I really appreciated this discussion. We really appreciate your commitment to this cause. I think we all recognize we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to leapfrog now, and it's people like yourselves who are enabling that to happen. As Mark has put in the chat now, just on the logistics, we're concluding this breakout session. We're back in the plenary, which was the original link. It's also in the chat. I'd encourage us all to go back into the plenary now, and thank you again. Stay safe.
Thanks very much to all speakers. Goodbye. See you in the plenary session. Thank you. Thanks again, Rob.